Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. This fall, Ken Burns will debut American Revolution, a 12-hour PBS documentary about the nation's founding and the Revolutionary War. Burns calls the Revolution one of the most important events in human history. However, our guest today argues that U.S. history would be better told by focusing on relationships with South America, which is the true origins of our hemispheric and global hegemony. Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings. We are excited to have a guest on our podcast, Greg Grandin. Greg, welcome. And you were in upstate New York, you were saying before we started recording, right?
Yeah, a rainy day in upstate New York. So it's the
good. And Greg is in Pittsburgh. Do you notice, Greg, that I always say half the time I say you're in Pittsburgh, half the time I say you're in Philadelphia?
Yeah, one of our followers pointed that out to me. They said, when did you move to Philadelphia? So okay. You may notice we're both old guys, so that's
it happens so much he doesn't correct me anymore. So
yeah.
Hey, you know, we usually don't get just horribly excited about a book, but oh my goodness, we are so glad to have you on to talk about your new book, America. Am I saying that right? How do you?
America, yeah.
America. And this is about 2 weeks ago, Greg and I chatted on the phone, and I said, "How are you doing with that book?" And we both said we just really couldn't put it down, and how wonderful a book it is. So, thank you for coming on and talking about this book. Before we get too far, you are a professor at Yale in history. You've written many books. You won a Pulitzer for your one book, the End of the Myth, which
from the border wall, from the frontier to the border wall in the mind of America.
Well, tell me a little bit about that. Tell me a little bit about that book, because that's that leading up to this book.
In a lot of ways, the argument of that book was meant to be in this book, but it was too specific, and it would have made this book too unwieldy. That book was trying to explain Donald Trump and the way that he turned the wall into a national myth in many ways, a symbol, you know, and thinking about how for centuries one of the primal myths of the United States is the frontier, right? A symbol of openness, and there's the frontier thesis of U.S. history, which posits that U.S.'s unique form of equality is forged on the frontier. And, Frederick Jackson Turner in the 1890s writing about the frontier as a place that not only produced equality, but produced curiosity, produced cosmopolitanism. He even went as far in a subsequent essay as to suggest that the organization of Western states was a model for the United Nations, openness to the world. And of course, that's not the way things turned out. And so I was trying to, what is it about Trump? I was trying to get away from debates about whether it was economics or culture or racism that explained it, and situate Trump more as what happens when a country that was forged in expansion, unlimited expansion, that had no, that there was no end in sight to what, and I'm not just talking about the landed frontier. I'm talking about opening markets, wars understood as advancing human progress and liberalism and technology. When the United States hits limits, and and the limits I was talking about then were the wars in the Middle East, the economic crisis, which brought an end to the conceits of globalization, that everybody was going to, free markets were going to lift every boat, and climate change. And what happens is what you get when a country that thought it had no limits hits its limit, is Trump is what you get.
You could say hits the wall when you're talking
Yeah,
about
it's the
Trump,
wall, right?
because
So
that's
what
sort
the
of,
extremism that used to be either kept at the margins of domestic society or exported outside domestic society now come directly into the heartland, and there's no more exporting, offshoring, or polarization.
hey, before we get to your other book, I just want to ask you this is a weird question in a way, but name dropping. I have a dear friend who's married to Michael Cunningham, who won the Pulitzer Prize for The Hours. He's just a wonderful, wonderful
Sure,
author.
sure. I remember that.
And he said after he won the Pulitzer, he said he kind of went through a period of depression for a short period of time because it stemmed from his feeling, am I ever going to be able to replicate this at this level, and was a little anxious about that. And then of course after a year or so he got over that and he's back in the saddle with some great novels. What was the effect of you getting such remarkable press and attention for this book? Did you
Yeah.
have any of those feelings at
Well,
all?
it was in the middle of COVID, right?
Oh,
So it
okay.
was in the middle of the lockdown when the announcement came out. They didn't even have a ceremony. So
Oh.
even so, though, I was elated and everything, but it was, and our situation was fine. It wasn't like I was sitting in a room by myself. We had a family and a small little pod. But more than that, I'm an interloper in U.S. history. I was
Hmm.
trained as a Latin Americanist, and I tend to view the United States from a wider lens from the outside, and you know to be a U.S. historian, it's really kind of a guild. If you have to be trained as a U.S. historian. So I mean, I have no complaints. My books have been well reviewed in places, and
Hmm.
I've
Hmm.
won different awards. But I do remember my colleague, who is one of these kind of classic U.S. historians that get called on by the Times, David Blight. And he won a Pulitzer, I think, for a book on Frederick Douglass. He just emailed me. He said, "Get ready for your life to change."
Hmm.
And like, nothing changed. I mean, no, I wasn't getting called up to comment on U.S. politics. Nothing really changed. I
Yeah.
mean, and I laugh about that because it wasn't like all of a sudden I was being asked by Ken Burns to comment on the American Revolution.
Yeah.
It's the argument is a little bit outside the historiographical arguments that U.S. historians make, so that I imagine they don't know what to do with it when you emphasize that the argument I was making in the end of the myth is an argument that many in the new left made, diplomatic historians that emphasized how the United States, you know, was a country that imagined itself as having a limitless frontier,
Right.
and the utility of a limitless frontier is that it could be projected into infinity, and that you could organize domestic politics by constantly promising, just by promising to open up further frontiers, whether it be markets or whatever, and that the notion of a common good, a collective good, isn't the creation of a virtuous state based on a citizenship and social citizenship through education and welfare and national health insurance, but the promise of constant economic growth. And so that argument, I think it's a good argument, but it doesn't fit easily in arguments that U.S. historians are who tend to operate.
Right. Right.
Um,
Well, let's get to America. Like I said, Greg and I absolutely loved it. Although you took my July from me. This is 700 plus pages, and it's we
736.
and
Well, that's with endnotes and everything.
okay. Well, good.
630 pages of writing.
Yeah, and Greg and I read it cover to cover, and it's just a kind of an
Thank
ambitious little overview of 5 centuries of the history of North and South America. And to turn it over to you to kind of give me a little better background, what I liked about it is we often view history beginning from kicking out the king, the British king. And it starts with the Mayflower, and it starts with and you go, whoa, 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 time out. Well, you could tell a better story of our past and current history if you look at our relationship with Central and South America.
Yeah.
And that is the two Americas. It's America, the United States, and America with the tilde over the E, which is all of the South. And that's your setup. Tell us if I got that right.
Yeah, yeah, you do. I was trying to tell the history of the New World, the Western Hemisphere, and situating the United States within that larger history. And of course, the Spanish conquest and Spanish colonialism happens long before English settlement and colonialism. But that's also the chronology often gets out of whack. My daughter's in the 7th grade, and they were studying the Salem witch trials, and it's a good progressive school, and they were teaching about Native Americans and whatnot. And I was like, sweet, I was like, that's all good, well and good, the 1600s, and but you do know the Spanish the Spanish conquest happened 100 years earlier, and Cortez and so it's just interesting the way the story is told, right? There's like people kind of forget that the Spaniards were there first, and to a larger degree, the Spanish Empire, which was a formidable institution, that it was the empire, the early modern empire. Those Puritans who landed in off of Cape Cod and Plymouth, they were, it occupied a big part of their geographical imagination. But the book really starts with the conquest, the Spanish conquest as a world historical event that kicks off what we might think of as political modernity, that the violence and horror, that what some demographers call the greatest human mortality event in history, something along the lines of 90% of 100 million people disappear within a century. And the first wave by conquistador violence, enslavement, displacement, hunger, that within the Catholic Church, that provoked a kind of moral backlash. There was the Protestant counter-revolution, which was a challenge from the outside and Northern Europe, but from within the heart of the Catholic Church, there were lawyers and priests and theologians who immediately began to question some of the basic principles, because Catholicism was a religion that pretended to be universal, it pretended to be the bearer of world history and the bearer of world knowledge. And as Bartolome de las Casas said, the Dominican Franciscan the Dominican priest who I begin the book with and spend a good deal of time with, he was like, what we presumed to be universal was really but provincial. Like the majority of the world's people, we didn't even know existed. Now he was wrong that there was a majority, but he was right that there was a lot of them, and an awareness that the New World was filled with human beings creates this debate about what is a human, what rights, what's and there was a cohort within Catholicism that pretty much laid out all of the insistence that all human beings are one and equal, and they all share the same lineage. They all come from Adam. There aren't different branches of humans and lesser humans which justify an argument that was used to justify slavery. There was a strong anti-slavery, pro-emancipationist thrust within this critique, and there was a critique of the conquest itself, that Spain had no right to take the lands and claim sovereignty over these people, and that critique didn't necessarily lessen the the violence and exploitation of Spanish conquest and Spanish imperialism, but it did create a powerful countercurrent within Spanish colonialism that in which Native Americans weren't like off on the sides or away on the frontier. They were the main thing. They were literally the main thing in the sense that they were extracting labor for the gold and the silver and the pearls and the wheat and Native Americans and African Americans, but they also were the main thing in terms of the moral justification for Spanish Catholic imperialism. So there was a sense of responsibility. There was a sociality there, an awareness of sociality that eluded later Protestant and colonial projects that happened a century later, a little bit more north, that led to the U.S. U.S. led to the creation of the United States.
Greg, jump in here. I haven't chatted much about your opinion about the book, other than you liked it. But fill me in on your observations about this book.
I think you really can't talk about the relations between North and South America, Northern America, the U.S. principally, and Latin America, without this book has to be considered. It has to be looked at. It's that important of a book. It's 630 pages, and it's, to my mind, it's myth busting and it's myth making. I mean, it shows from the very beginning, when the Spanish conquest begins, how existing myths were burst at that time and how new myths arose. And I don't think it ends. I think the myths just continue on and on. Eric Hobsbawm once said that the United States Revolution, the U.S. Revolution, doesn't fit when people talk about revolutions. The French Revolution is the paradigm because it fits the European notion of feudalism going into capitalism and so on. But what happens in the New World is about everything. I mean, it affects the entire world in such a way, and there are so many new ideas. The chapters on rights and the construction of rights. Typically we think of rights arising in Europe as time capitalism arises, but much of what De Las Casas and others are contending with gives a new life to the whole notion of a rights doctrine, and helps put meat on that going forward. I think you handle that very, very well. So it's an exciting book, an essential book. Where I disagree with it, we can discuss, but 630 pages, you're going to find things you don't agree with.
Yeah.
But in general, it's just such an enlightenment, such a pleasure to read, such a pleasure to read. So
thanks. That is some of the feedback. Some of the feedback I've been getting. I actually feel like people, despite the length, find it readable.
Oh yeah. I was frustrated when it was over. It just was.
It can't possibly be true.
No, it is just because it just these little gems of learning about. I mean, you start off with the cannibalism, which just is like right out of Stephen King. I mean, is this a history or is this a horror? And the dilemma of the Catholic Church and trying to understand the relationship between people and races
just formally, just talking formally, forget about the content. But most books we encounter, many books we encounter, are small ideas that somebody expands to 35 or 40 pages to justify it being a chapter in a book. In this case, there were big ideas, and lots of them, they kind of overflow the book. There are too many ideas to be contained in 630 pages. And they're done in very tiny chapters, very readable, very quick chapters. So you go through it and you're saying, oh, wow, that was really rich. Now what's next? And so I think, it bodes well for your future writing. I hope you expand on some of these. These ideas.
But I was trying to make it. I mean, I knew it was going to be big. I knew, but I knew it was. And you could, at any given tangent, any different point, I could have elaborated on various tangents and and how come, where's Canada? Like how many reviews have noted that I didn't deal with Canada? But I thought I dealt with Canada in the beginning by saying Canadians don't consider themselves Americans because of the whole British, so I thought, okay, I dealt with Canada. But the name.
Let me bring up what I think are some of the things I disagree with. And they really begin near the end of the book, because I think with your take on Roosevelt and the New Deal, you expose your politics. And out of respect for your politics, they're not mine, but I think it's a social democratic picture of the world, and it's one in which you perhaps find in places that really aren't there. And I think, for example, I'll give you an example. You make a fuss over Roosevelt visiting Latin America in 1936, and it's a glorious trip. And they were, for the first time, they were feeling good about North America, about the United States. But it's also the era that I know a bit about, and it's the Spanish Civil War. And in fact, and you allude to it, I mean, it's not as though you ignore it, but that was an enormous factor in criticizing U.S. relations with the rest of the world. They let the Spanish Republic die. The U.S. did, along with England and France, and the Spanish people, the Spanish countries in South America and Central America knew that, and so I think it blemished a lot of the excitement. I think the Cardenas thing is also really what I've read about the U.S.'s stance regarding Cardenas when he made the changes, was there was a tremendous amount of hostility, a tremendous amount of challenge to that. And you account that, but I think you still see hope, or I don't see the hope from the New Deal. I think the New Deal wasn't really capable of handling that.
Yeah. I mean, these are all good points. To step back a second, I mean, the whole book is a book of dealing of being sympathetic to institution. I mean, the whole first part is about being sympathetic with the Catholic Church, which Sidney Hook called the greatest totalitarian institution in the world. I mean, some of these reviews that I got from, kind of anti-communist, or or kind of knee-jerk, because at the end I say a few good, I'm trying to wrap it up. And what can I possibly say about Nicaragua and Venezuela at the end of a 736 page book that really starts with, the conquest. And so, like, I try to acknowledge that, they're authoritarian, but we could understand their authoritarianism within this historical context, whatever. And so I get criticized for that. I was like, did this person not realize that the whole book is sympathetic to the Catholic Church, and they're criticizing me for being sympathetic to Chávez? Like, I mean, who in world history, who did more damage, the Catholic Church or Chávez? I mean, between the pedophiles, between the Inquisition, between the tortures, between justifying colonialism, and the book is trying to tease out the emancipationist kind of counter-hegemonic current within the Catholic Church, and understand how that explodes into liberation theology later on, and how it also at the same time accounts for the sociability of Latin America, both as on an everyday experiential level, and as it manifests as the vanguard of what we consider social rights. So all of these institutions, the New Deal, Roosevelt, Cardenas, Bolivar, they're all complicated figures that have plenty of things to critique about them. But
That's the value. That's what I was alluding to with the idea of myth busting. I mean, the myths that most of the myths about our history are myths. I mean, they're just crude, they're vulgar, they're bad guys and good guys. And the book certainly, if it does nothing else, it explodes all that. I mean, the Catholic Church is a great example. It brings a great deal of evil, but it also, there's elements of transcending goodness that come out of
and if you're and I agree, End of the Myth goes a little bit more into detail of the fundamental contradictions of the New Deal, how on the one hand it did insert into US political culture the language of social citizenship and social rights, and a new ethos of government regulation as being morally allowable. But on the other hand, it led to the foundation, created and planted the seeds of its own undermining with, its promotion of large scale agriculture and its promotion of certain kind of corporations. So, and then you really see it coming apart in the 1970s. So, yeah, I agree. I mean, FDR, sure, FDR should have, should have saved the Spanish Republic. He shouldn't have interned the Japanese citizens. He himself, was a youthful imperialist. It's unclear how much he really changed as he got older, but he certainly was astute enough and comfortable enough in his position to allow certain more open-minded critics of U.S. power to have positions of authority and have an influence in Latin America. And the main thing was that a lot of the New Deal geopolitical theorists that worried about the rise of fascism in Europe were exactly worried about the Spanish Civil War spilling over into Latin America. That Latin America could become a continent-wide Spanish Civil War. All of the sociological variables were there. Small landed class, Praetorian, Catholic, conservative, patriarchal, under threat by a militant labor and peasant movements. This was their nightmare, that the Mexican Revolution and the rest of Spanish America would become one large Spain and run, an ally, so allied with Portugal and Spain and Italy and Germany and that would have been a strategic nightmare for the United States in terms of defense, and hence the tipping to the kind of tipping the scales in support of allowing for economic nationalism, not giving Vargas a hard time that he wasn't elected, kind of continuing to buy Mexican silver during even as Cardenas was siding with Wells against Hull in a lot of those debates about Mexico. It all tipped the scales a little bit to the center left, to the left, to the economic nationalists, to the anti-fascists.
I'd like to talk about one general theme that I thought you did such a good job in the book. When you look at America, North America, we have our capitalism and take our surplus value and kind of give it to the billionaires and the corporations. You look at Central America and you talk about how within their constitutions, they're much more likely to describe social programs. You mentioned Puerto Rico wanting to put in their constitution guaranteed right for health care and
that's an end of the myth. That story is an end of the myth. Yeah.
Yeah, it just is. So anyway, the idea that they are much more socially engaged with their community, and we are in this myth of the great, go out west and do it by yourself, and you're an individual, and it's you don't need the government. And that tension has been a tension between the two countries because we, of course, define that as you're all going to be communists in Cuba, and that's why we need to crush you and bring the Chicago boys down there to kind of straighten things up and get you back on the right track with this, banana republic stuff. I don't know. That's a little bit of word salad, but do you get my point?
Yeah. And part of the book was trying to explain that tension, that why United
Yes.
States has become the kind of last, almost crystalline defender of a pure form of individual rights. I mean, if anything binds the right together in the United States, it's the commitment, even if there's many contradictions in terms of patriarchy and gender, but the fetish of individual rights, that
Right.
the only virtuous state is a state that stands back and lets the individual, the greatest realm of movement, to believe, to gather, to bear arms, if if that's your opinion, to act out of their own interests and ambitions. Whereas Latin America is in some ways, I try to make the case that it's the originator of what we now call social rights, in which the state isn't just to stand back, but it's to step forward and capture surplus value and redistribute it in the form of social rights, the right to education, the right to healthcare. All of those require state action, actually acting, not just stepping back. And Latin America, the Mexican Revolution, its 1917 constitution was the world's first constitution that had social rights in it, before Weimar, before India, before any European, certainly before the World War II. So this notion of social rights, I was trying to get at the origins of. And, you know, intellectual historians, more conservative intellectual historians of a few generations ago would identify Latin America's kind of chronic reversion to populism, to kind of getting behind the Cordillo, rejecting free market economics as some combination of Spanish integralism that they didn't want to give up, the idea that the world represents a more holistic thing, or peasant collectivism, or what I was trying to do is kind of look at those things from a more positive perspective, right, and understand how, yes, that the foundations of a sociability that exists in Latin America that has been profoundly consequential, and also accounts for the persistence of democracy in Latin America. I mean, the amount of violence directed at Latin American reformers of all stripes, from nationalists to center leftists to feminists to today to trans activists, environmental. I mean, more environmental activists are executed in Latin America than any other comparable region, and I think the same could be hold true for trade unionists, and yet they never stop. Right, they never end. Right. They keep fighting, and Latin American nationalism never devolves, for the most part. And we could talk about the present and the infection of Trumpism into Latin American political culture. But for the most part, Latin America's put forth a nationalism that was simultaneously nationalist but also universalist. They didn't, Latin America was one of the hardest hit regions from neoliberalism or economic globalization, Clintonism, whatever you want to call it. And yet their response wasn't to, talk about the globalists or talk about the Jews or talk about whatever. Their response was to fight the corporations, and that kind of nationalism that still understands itself as a stepping stone to universalism is really a remarkable historical phenomenon that I felt like needed to be accounted for. And within that is the conception of a notion of democracy that is social democracy. So much of the contributions to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which tried to balance individual and social and economic rights, came from Latin America. Came from countries like Panama and Dominican Republic and Mexico and Brazil, delegates insisting. And if you go back to the early constitutions of the independence period, they all emphasized a republicanism that insisted that there was no, all those constitutions likewise defined individual rights as sacrosanct. You had the right to property and the right to speech and all that stuff, but they explicitly said the individual can't exist outside of a viable social commonweal, that one nurtures the other, and they were very much aware of that, and that tension continues to this day with the United States as a kind of bearer of individual rights, and Latin America as an agent of social rights, and you see it in Mexico in particular right now.
Greg, jump in here. What do you think? Is that
yeah, he tells that story. You tell that story very well, Greg. I mean but again, it's nuanced, and you're a master of nuance. But you look at the trade-off around the United Nations notion of rights. Yes, the U.S., as you tell very well, the U.S. put together a group of people based upon these Latin American countries that would support the US. The trade-off was you can put some social rights or positive rights, as they're often called, into the charter. But the game is that you're going to support us in the Cold War. You're going to be on our side in the Cold War. I mean, you find those in the post-war period, you find all kinds of trade-offs like that. They're nuanced. Even the Europeans today, I mean, you can't account for the fact that they're making deals with Trump. It makes no sense that they're making these. They're not to their advantage.
But don't
They
they
have a
ebb and
deal. They have a
they ebb
deal.
and flow with that though, don't they? I mean, they do. They ebb and flow, but they tend to ultimately go more towards a social. I mean, the
Well,
dictators come.
as explained in the book, very, very well. I mean, you look at the tradition that their constitutions come out of,
Mhm.
and their understanding of it's almost a defiant thing to put in where property rights are central in European rights doctrines. Property rights are the basis, they're fundamental. That's number one. In this case, in defiance of that kind of notion, these countries are going to say, yeah, we want to put positive rights in as well. And all credit to that. But in general, they're kind of trade-offs. They're trade-offs, political trade-offs, because
Yeah.
they're still class-based countries. I think that's somewhat lost in your recounting of their history, is that they are class-based and they evolved as in terms of
Yeah.
internal classes.
I agree that they're class-based, and I agree that there were limits, but I do believe there was a contingent moment, coming out of World War II and the last year of World War II, where they didn't think it was a trade-off. When there was this from the 44 to 46 period, there was this widespread transition to to a more robust version of a socialized democracy in Latin America, in which dictatorships gave way to democracies, and democracies became more social and put into place policies of welfare states. And there was this moment from 44 to 46, and it corresponds to the most hopeful expressions of the New Deal. And I use Henry Wallace to a large degree to kind of capture that you don't defeat fascism just on the battlefield. You have to raise global wages. And Wallace is down in Latin America promising everybody, that the United States is going to continue to invest in surplus value adding industries. Of course, that's not what happens.
Right.
And yes, there is class-based societies, and it's a conjunction. There's class-based societies in Latin America, and then there's also the policy which Latin Americans didn't expect. They really did think that there was going to be some kind of a Marshall Plan for them that to help them industrialize in a way outside of pure market. But then you had George Marshall himself, in Bogota saying, no, you are part of the Marshall Plan, but you ain't getting any money. Your role is to supply Europe with raw
Yeah,
materials, and that has the sociological effect of evaporating the middle ground. So yes, in Europe, you could have a welfare state because you could have Christian Democrats and you could have social anti-communist, anti-Soviet Christian Democrats and social democrats pushing for an expansion of the welfare states and labor rights. And they were, but because Europe had access to capital, public capital, and cheap credit to industrialize, they didn't need to repress those forces. In the United States, I'm sorry, in Latin America, you had George Marshall telling Latin American industrialists that, if you want to industrialize, you basically need to attract private risk capital. And how do you attract private risk capital? You don't just become anti-communist. You pacify, the entire center. Everybody gets.
That's consistent with U.S. foreign policies as being shaped at that time. It's very
Yeah,
consistent. I mean,
yeah.
they were
But
on an
Latin Americans
anti-communist
didn't
crusade.
expect that to happen.
Yeah, but I'm saying, for example, when you look at when Nixon went to Venezuela, went to Latin America, and he was booed and rocks were thrown at him. So you could say, people will say, well, Venezuela was anti-US. Well, that was the left in Venezuela. That was the left in Latin America doing that. At the same time, there was a right in Latin America and there was a capitalist class in Latin America, and
Yeah.
people, landowners in Latin America. And somehow that's lost, I think, even today when we discuss the global South. And so there's the similar myth that everything is ugly about the United States. But the United States also is a class society, and it has a left, and it has a working
But
class.
Greg, who is the right? The right is us meddling. The right is us
No,
going
we're
to
not us.
Brazil.
No, we're not us. But what I'm challenging is this idea of us. I think that's a simplification, and that's part of one of those myths that we haven't gotten over because we continue to talk about the global South. I just wrote a piece in which thanks to Oxfam, they did some research and I used it on Africa and the class situation in Africa and how many billionaires there are for billionaires in Africa, many, many millionaires of the class system, and lots of what goes on in Africa in terms of their failure to develop in a way that it helps the people of Africa is reflected in the class situation, in a division of wealth and incomes in those countries. The same thing is true in South America. They're oligarchs. There may be
Yeah,
small scale oligarchs,
absolutely.
but they determine a lot of the politics of the area.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, the class structure of Latin America, as I mentioned, the sociological variables that made it very similar to Spain, a very small class, manufacturing class, and to a large degree, political power was still wielded by landed oligarchs, and the combination of the anti-fascist organizing that as part of a global movement of 1930s combined with the United States for a short but consequential time support uh, being more focused on fighting fascism than communism led to a certain kind of political opening that was consequential. I mean, that changes on a dime in 1947 in Latin America, where they switched from being fighting fascists to fighting communists.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and the perfect example of that is, and the example that I use in the book, also all of that during the war, during the fight against fascism, the United States, through its Hemispheric Lend-Lease program, invested enormous repressive capacity in these Latin American militaries.
That was done very
And the
well.
perfect example of that is Chile. I mean, Chile elects in 1947 a popular front government, as they're partying like it's 1941 over there. They elect a popular front government that promises all of the promises to continue the alliance between the socialists and the communists and the liberals, and then there's the strike. There's the copper strike, the miners' strike, and that starts to spread in 48, and the government turns on the communists on a dime, and uses the planes and the ships to literally occupy the northern part of Chile and suppress the strike. And the person in charge of that operation was none other than a young lieutenant named Augusto Pinochet.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's a perfect example, So, and yes, all of this stuff is then hitched to anti-communist through anti-communist trade unionists who continued to be social democratic in name, or but in Europe, in Europe, there was a space for an anti-communist social democratic political force to create strong welfare states. So from 44 to 46, this is born in democracy. From 46 to 48, it all closes down. Then that cycle intensifies and quickens. It's that polarization. You can really chase every country is different, but by the time you get to 59, it's a little bit more of a political opening, because I mean they stone Nixon because they just had this revolution that overthrows Perez Jimenez, and the United States takes him in and gives him political asylum, and then of course then there's the Cuban Revolution, and then there's all of the anti-communist covert action that happens with that, and that really closes the political space. Then you start to see I mean, I like to think of it as that there's the Kennedy coups and then there's the Kissinger coups. The Kennedy coups happened immediately after the Cuban Revolution and happened pretty much, in a lot of Central American countries as well as a few Caribbean countries, and then as they kind of play themselves out, by the time you get to Kissinger, you have a whole new wave of coups in Uruguay and in Argentina that install much more deadly death squad states. And then, of course, the whole thing kind of culminates in Central America with the Central American Wars, and then the region is thought to be safe for neoliberalism. That the United States had.
I think probably some of my criticism is it's personal because I was very active in the Chile Solidarity movement. That's probably when I got my feet wet politically.
Yeah.
And I knew exiles and I'd visited Chile after Pinochet. So I feel very strongly about that. And many of us on the left thought that was the last real chance for a real socialism, and a real socialism that could be gotten without, frankly, a revolution.
Yeah, and it's a good example of the co-optation of a lot of that social democratic language under the form of the Christian Democrats of reform. But then when Allende is voted in, the Christian Democrats become an agent of destabilization. Yeah.
We've had on people in just the last couple of years, Dan Cavallis, who's written a lot about Nicaragua and so forth, and we had him on talking about the pink wave, about how all the countries were becoming progressive. And then we have 4 months ago, you write this article in The Intercept, Latin America's new right ushers in Pan-American Trumpism. So we're for one time we're having, oh, this is wonderful. These social movements are coming, and now we're on the verge of just about putting our head in the oven and turning on the gas. I mean, you've got Venezuela, Brazil is on the edge, Argentina. Talk about your article that you wrote about this Pan-American Trumpism. I know you're a historian, but see if you can be a soothsayer and tell where are we going with this.
As an historian, you can never go back far enough to put it in context. But the disaster of neoliberalism, the failure of neoliberal, the Chilean coup is as good enough a marker as any to mark the beginning of the imposition of a new political economic regime of austerity, weakening labor rights, lowering the end of state developmentism, whether it be on the left or the right, and that had devastating consequences for Latin America. Once the Cold War was over and Latin Americans were able to vote their preference for the most part, they started electing center leftists again and leftists. And by 2002, 2003, 2004, you had that great pink wave of Latin American leaders, right? Chávez in Venezuela, Lula in Brazil, the Kirchners in Argentina, Evo Morales would be elected by 2008 in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, the center-left, Bachelet in Chile. They all represented different currents of the historic Latin American left. In Paraguay, there was a liberation theologian president. In Brazil, there was a trade unionist. In Bolivia, there was a peasant indigenous organizer. In Argentina, there were Peronist populists. In Chile, there was a feminist. In Ecuador, there was a left Keynesian heterodox historian. So it was in some ways the full palette of the Latin American left was in power, while the Bush administration and they spoke with a very strong rhetorical voice, and they dominated electorally and they dominated rhetorically, particularly when George W. Bush was in office and the war, and they posed a very strong counter to the war on terror. They refused to participate in the global rendition program, and they offered an alternative to U.S. policy in the Middle East, and Chávez's vision of a multipolar world and strengthening the BRICS and all of that stuff, and Lula's, which was also Lula's vision, Lula and Chávez playing good cop, bad cop, a kind of Laurel and Hardy routine in which Lula would provide, Chávez would be out there doing whatever, and Lula would be providing him legitimate cover, because they took Lula was a serious moderate social democrat, so it was a moment. It was under Obama that got rolled back. Obama was much more effective at rolling back the left than George W. Bush was. And one of the things that Obama did, the expansion of oil and natural gas, was targeted at Venezuela's use of oil rents to fund international solidarity and domestic social programs. And, the expansion, the fracking, the getting Canada online, beginning of privatization of Pemex in Mexico, Hillary Clinton and Obama, that was all them. And also the support of lawfare campaigns against Lugo in Paraguay, Dilma Rousseff, Lula's successor in Brazil, and Manuel Zelaya in Honduras, really began the rollback of that. At the same time, the traditional Latin American right couldn't compete electorally against this new left. They lost almost every election. The traditional kind of anti-communist, law and order, patria familia, patriarch, billionaire oligarch, they just didn't have a program. They couldn't gain traction. So jump forward after Obama's, I'm not saying that the Latin American left didn't make its own mistakes. They made plenty of mistakes and whatever. But really the rollback was under Obama. So you jump forward and with this rise of a new kind of culture war right, obsessed about conspiracy, and as the left kind of receded and lost ground, and commodity prices started falling, and they lost an election here, they lost an election there, they began to lose a lot of that hegemony that they had built up, and in its place there emerged, just like in the United States, this kind of world-building conspiracism, tied to things like gun rights and grooming and sexual rights. And, the first person killed in a Honduran coup was a trans woman. It really was, that coup was as much about the, Zelaya's tolerance of rights, sexual rights movements and activists, as it was, about agro biofuel. But so jump forward to the present, you have a right now in Latin America that is very Trumpist, that feels, whether it be Javier Milei in Argentina or Noboa in Ecuador, that's finding a voice, finding new wedges, new points of cleavage that they can run on, and so, but it cuts both ways because Trump oversteps, right? So Trump is intervening, doing what he can to bring Bolsonaro back in Brazil, but at the same time, that's strengthening Lula's popularity because, there's, Lula's winning as of now, this little competition over tariffs and free speech. There's this whole, we can get into the whole free speech thing in Brazil. It's it's a whole rabbit hole. But so there is this kind of Trumpist right in Latin America, and people are tired. People are tired of there's a lot of violence. There's a lot of violence associated with the drug economy. There's a lot of corruption, and the appeal of somebody like Milei or somebody like Noboa in Peru is understandable, and Bukele in El Salvador. But for the most part, I don't know. I'd say Latin America is kind of on a knife's edge. There's still a strong left. I mean, look at Mexico. Mexico is probably the one country in which the left is still on the ideological offensive. Where it's not just like reacting to this crazy right-wing culture war conspiracism, and where it's actually, it has a more Morena, Claudia AMLO, and now Claudia Scheinbaum have a moral worldview that people can recognize, and not that they're perfect, and not that they have limits to what they can do, but they have 80% popularity. I mean, we're talking about a hegemonic coalition here that's somehow equal to the New Deal in its potential endurance. Um, you know, Other countries have leftist leaders now, but they're not that popular, and the next round of elections will probably go to the right in Chile and Colombia coming up. It looks like Lula will run in 2026, and it looks like he'll win as of now, as of what the polls say, and that's likely thanks to Trump. So on the one hand, there's this potential for Trump, possibility to build a pan-American Trumpism, but by doing so, he also kind of activates the forces in reaction to it, and pushback. So
Yeah, I'm
yeah,
surprised
so
at
it's a
the whole evangelical thing in Brazil. Gone from 5% to 35%, and
and more importantly, the
man,
evangelicals were in Lula's coalition when he was first elected. They weren't politicized,
unreal how
and now
effective they are
well,
in
it's the
dealing with
work
it.
done. It's the work done by U.S. churches and the Atlas Foundation, and there's a lot of intentional exporting of culture war politics into Latin America.
They
You
were
know,
in Lula's coalition. I didn't
at
know that.
first,
I didn't
yeah,
know that. That's
First,
that's
yeah,
at
incredible.
first, evangelicals supported Lula
I
PT
didn't
during
know that.
in 2002.
Yeah. I,
But as Judith Butler and trans and don't groom my
right.
kid, all of that stuff. I mean, that stuff, you know anchor
yeah.
babies now,
Greg,
birth
you got a kid in middle school. You got to be careful that they'll come as a girl and come back as
yeah, you never
I
know.
mean, you never.
Never know.
So it's a real issue you got to worry
Yeah.
about.
And
So
like Bukele offered a real model in El Salvador for people who are tired of crime, right? I mean, if you're living in
right,
Guatemala
right.
and you're living in you got to look at El Salvador and say, well, okay, maybe that's the price of like safe streets. But now that Bukele has been like the global face of Trumpism as like being his basically prisoner, his jail, his prison warden, his global prison warden, that's got to take some of the luster off of the Bukele
But
model.
but let
could
me ask you a question.
go ahead,
Why? I
Greg.
mean, I'm enlightened about that. I had no idea that the evangelicals were in with Lula. But
At
how
first.
did how did they emerge as Pat said from 5% to 35? How did they over? I mean,
Because of our
presumably the
meddling.
liberation. Well,
It's
wait a
our
minute.
meddling.
The liberation theology had a grip there. How did this happen? How did
Well, there's been a lot of pastoral work done by evangelicals. This started under Reagan. Iran-Contra was a trial run. The U.S. The push for conversion. The prosperity gospel has a lot of appeal to a lot of people in Latin America. The limits of the Catholic Church. I mean, there's a lot of social misery in Latin America that provides openings for alternatives, and you know and I guess the Catholic Church has been hemorrhaging members everywhere, not just in Latin America, but certainly the rise of you know and all of these groups have a foreign policy. So the NRA, right? So in Lula's first term, he was going to put forward a national referendum on gun control, and it had overwhelming support. Overwhelming support. Everybody thought it was going to pass by large margins. The NRA started spending millions of dollars on a campaign to the NRA basically had a foreign policy, and by the time it was over, Lula lost that amendment, lost that vote. And now you have like in Argentina, Javier Milei talks about no, I'm sorry, it's in Brazil. Brazil's Joao's son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, talks about the Second Amendment as if it's in the Brazilian Constitution.
Yeah,
I don't know what
yeah.
the Second Amendment is in the Brazilian Constitution,
He
but I know
doesn't
it's
either,
not,
obviously.
but I know it's not gun. I know it's not the right anything about the right to bear arms. So there's a globalization of the globalization of Intifada. There's globalization of the Second Amendment. People talking about the Second Amendment as a
Yeah. Hey, we better wrap this up. Oh my goodness, this has got to be so much fun to read a great book and then to have the author on and have good conversations. And this has just been a real treat for me. So I don't know.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you, and thank you, and I appreciate the pushback on certain things and chance to clarify my thoughts on some of it. Some of it is writing, like the trying to keep it tight and not not and
Well,
being aware that it was going to be a long book and I can go off on tangents and just trying to keep the story tight, which meant maybe smoothing over some things.
well, I
It's a
think
long essential book.
I wanna defend you. The nice thing about Greg is that we'll read a book and sometimes we'll be just simpatico. This was the greatest thing. The next time we just disagree. He's a curmudgeon, but he really liked your book, so that's that's that you got to say
The
something.
other guy. Oh, I thought
He's not wrong. I'm not easy, so he's
He's
not wrong.
not. He's not.
He
He's
did
not
like your
easy.
book.
He's not. He's the guy on the bench with the cane yelling at skateboarders. He can be kind of grumpy, but
Marx notoriously said question everything, and that's one thing I did learn from Karl Marx. I got right, so I question everything.
Yes, a ruthless
But
critique
your
of
book
everything.
was really a joy.
oh,
I mean,
Thanks
just
so
so
much.
much, so great. So
it's a
listen,
joy
thanks.
to
Keep
read.
at it. Keep writing. I'm glad you didn't get depressed and thrown off track by your Pulitzer. So like a Cunningham. So that's good. And I was just really looking forward to following you and your writing and your books. So thank you for
Thanks so
being on.
much. Thanks, Pat. Thanks, Greg. It's been really great. This has been one of the
Okay.
Thanks.
best interviews. Thank you.